Area native. He is an alumni of the University of San Francisco, where he studied politics and philosophy. From 2008 to 2014, he worked for the Ecology Center for Berkeley, where he became impassioned around fighting for food justice, environmental justice, and sustainable community solutions. Currently, CAD is the project director at CompassPoint in Oakland. So if some of you do not know them, they are a premier consulting firm, a nonprofit organization that helps leaders, nonprofit organizations, and movements committed to social justice realize their full power. I personally met CAD about 1.5 years ago. I had applied on behalf of IECC to be part of a cohort called the Next Generation Leaders of Color. And I'm proud to say I am an alumni of a Next Gen leader. And I know there's some of us in the room as well today, so welcome all my Next Gen family. CompassPoint started this work 2 years ago, and it's been an honor now that we are going to be able to continue the work that they started here in the Inland Empire. When we were planning for this conference, I knew of all the voices that I thought would be important for us to be able to share with you would be CAD's voice. He has a unique grace about the ability to communicate that's extraordinarily thoughtful and articulate. He almost is poetic, to be honest, in the way he can facilitate really complex issues and make them so personal to those that are able to hear him. But I think what is kind of the lethal combination for him is that he also has the power and the strength of his intellect. So it is with great honor that I present to you our plenary starting our conference today, Mr. CAD Smith.
Wow, thank you, Susie. That was a very lovely introduction. Appreciate it. I was trying not to blush so hard over here. I think the background made it easier for folks not to tell that I was embarrassed. Perhaps is not it, but I was very flattered. So I appreciate that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and pull up just a few slides. So one moment, y'all, as I set my screen up, and appreciate the ask and the request for grace that was made early in the kind of opening. I will definitely ask for the same grace as we think about the hiccups of technology and also trying to make this plenary talk accessible to folks. Deep, deep appreciation is what I want to start off with to everyone who's present, for those of you who, even in the midst of everything going on, with the challenges and the demands of your attention, the challenges and demands of what's at home, the work that you're stewarding, to make time to be here and to support IECC and to think about what does thriving look like for you as an individual within the nonprofit organization and nonprofit sector, for the folks you work with, both your colleagues and the communities that you are a part of, and even more purposefully, and kind of what we're going to talk about today, the organizations of which you are a part of who are providing valuable community assets. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm going to do I see Susie still on camera. So Susie, my screen looks okay. It's visible. I will not be monitoring chat unless time permits. So if there's something, I would ask of the panelists to lift it up. And if there is time, I am open to some Q&A to do further meaning making and kind of some of the concepts and content that we cover. So I'm going to go ahead and actually start us off with the request to really get grounded in our breath. And this may feel like, for some, less of a traditional request for the way in which you might start off a plenary talk. And for others, this may feel very aligned with how you hold space, with how you've been able to kind of get grounded specifically in this virtual environment we find ourselves in. I'm going to ask that everyone takes a moment to get connected to breath. And I think it's not lost upon me that, as you all know, quite literally in 2020, it's been very challenging for us to prioritize our connection to breath. And so what do I mean by that? Whether it's the air quality that we are surrounded by, whether it's the threat and the looming threat of COVID-19 and the pandemic that we are combating, or it's state-sanctioned violence that quite literally has choked the life out of Black and brown folks. I hope we're all realizing the immense value to quite simply being able to breathe. So in a moment, for just about 60 seconds, I'm going to ask that everyone take a moment to get connected to their breath, and I'm actually going to be completely quiet. So when you're doing this breathing exercise and you're pairing it up with what's on the screen, What I want you to do is to inhale as the image expands and exhale as it collapses, and do so to whatever ability you have in this particular moment. Take this time to get grounded and to get present, knowing that there are so many things that could be pulling at your attention, whether it's the long list of email, whether it's dependents that you have in the background. I'm going to trust you all's discretion to take care of yourself. And as my colleague Fela Thomas says, to BYOB, which means be your own boo. So please do what you need to take care of yourself and use your best discretion. When you're doing this breathing exercise, and after I go to a moment of silence, I'm going to encourage folks to really set your intentions over what you want from this conference and the sessions that you are going to be attending. Perhaps you'll just take a moment to calm down a racing mind. Do with this exercise as you so choose, but please do focus on getting connected with your breath. So I'm going to give us 60 seconds. I will say no more. Take this moment to really get in touch with your breath. Take just another 20 seconds or so. Final few breaths. Right on, y'all. Thanks for indulging me in that request. A little bit of a sneak peek into facilitator state of mind. I also am privileged enough at CompassPoint to have taught public speaking. So that just also helped calm me down. And somatically, I'm feeling much more comfortable in my body. And also about talking today on the topic of what do our nonprofits really need to be poised for a movement and not just this particular moment. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of definitional work throughout this conversation of what I mean by that, and also share some things that I'm seeing by way of the work that I do at CompassPoint and being privileged enough to work day in and day out with leaders and folks who are stewarding community change through nonprofits as vehicles for the change that they desire to see in the world that they're navigating. So before I move on, Susie has already done a delightful kind of introduction of the organization in which I belong to. I also am repping in my background. And CompassPoint is a 45 or so year old organization. At the core of what we do, we are helping nonprofit organizations as well as leaders and folks working in movement contexts where there's an explicit commitment to social justice and transformation to realize their full power. And when we talk about full power, we're talking about the capacity to influence outcomes. One of my favorite ways to think about a definition of power actually comes by way of Oakland legend Bobby Seale, former co-founder of the Black Panther Party. And Bobby Seale used to say, power is the ability to define phenomenon and make it act in a desired manner. So when we think about the phenomenon of which we are trying to define in our everyday work, whether you work in food justice, housing, public health, you are trying to tackle a complex and often multi-layered problem that you've seen by way of your professional work or even the personal lived experiences you've had, and then thinking about how do we change that problem and address it with a solution-oriented mindset so that this problem no longer is perpetuated amongst the community we serve or the community we are a part of. CompassPoint loves to see the folks that we are in community with actualize that full power in ways that are rooted in a paradigm shift of understanding the value that nonprofits can provide. We do this through a couple of different ways. Susie has already alluded to the leadership development lens that we bring. We strongly believe that when we invest in our leaders, that is a critical contribution and addition to social justice efforts. We also believe that our communities deserve and are demanding an approach to leadership development that centers liberation. So let me break that down for you. When we talk about leadership development, we are talking about folks who aren't always in positional leadership within an organizational context. I once heard a quote that leadership is an action or an act and not a position. And I fundamentally do this work with that as a driving premise. So when we think about developing our leaders, this can be anyone from somebody who just stepped in day one on an organization and has a real strong commitment to the mission and to how you're responding to community, or this can be the most senior executive leaders who've been in an organization, perhaps founded it, have been there tenured for decades plus. We think that by investing in their critical consciousness and their ability to respond to community needs, that is a valuable contribution to transforming our societies. When we talk about liberation, there is an underlying premise that the way in which our social construct is currently designed is not serving the needs of everyone. There are some who benefit from the current construct, and there are others who exist on the margins. And when we talk about marginalization, we are often sorting the work of scholar and renowned thought leader Bell Hooks. So when we talk about liberation in the context of our work, we really do want to elevate and center the voices of those who have experienced intersecting systems of oppression and have experienced marginalization in their communities, in an organizational context, and start to say, what are the problems you've been challenged by, and what do you think the solutions are? That is a liberatory practice that CompassPoint holds near and dear to the way in which we do this work. Some of our values that I would like to lift up as they do inform the way in which we think specifically about our contribution to a movement and not a moment is being a values-driven organization. And so these core values, I should say, of racial justice, solidarity, radical imagination, place and community, accountability, learning and rigor, collaboration, humor and joy, should be showing up in everything we do if we're doing what we say we want to do in integrity, right? So when we turn to making decisions, when we think about what partnerships we into, when we think about the work that we have to prioritize in an ever demanding environment that we all find ourselves navigating, these values are what we should be returning to say, this is what we're using to inform the choices we make when at these choice points that can oftentimes be very, very complex. I love this quote from Angela Davis, which explains what we mean by radical. Sometimes radical doesn't always connote well amongst folks. Radical simply means grasping things at the root. And so when you think about radical imagination, how do we start to imagine solving challenges and problems at their root as opposed to just the surface level, of which I, as a leader in an organizational context, am so familiar with wanting to solve things at the surface, because getting to that root takes more time, more effort, and can quite literally be much more challenging and demanding of me. But is really where, if I could, I would prioritize the majority of my time. And when doing my work at the highest level, that's where I'm sitting. A little bit about me, because I feel that this is important. Y'all are giving me the space to be sharing at this plenary talk, and it's important that we tell our stories. I find that to be imperative for us to get reconnected to what essentially brought us into this work, and also to stay rejuvenated in those moments of exhaustion and depletion. Remembering where we come from, who inspired us to do this work, I think is invaluable. So I think it's important for the folks who are in the quote unquote room with me, the virtual room, to know that I've spent 13 plus years working in the nonprofit sector. Susie already gave you my background, working with the Ecology Center, really developing at that time my voice in a systems analysis through urban ecology and food justice. I'm now privileged enough to sit on the board of directors as one of the board members at that organization. The 6 to 7 years there really led me to also understand just how powerful nonprofits can be as vehicles for community change. And I think even more importantly, and perhaps one thing that I don't always speak to, as spaces for young voices, as young folks, to find their voice. So the work that I was doing was a part of a youth development program, of which we still run and have actually scaled up, And I think that those folks who are in the room today who do that youth development work, I want to especially send you some warm fuzzies and some high praises, because I know I'm the direct beneficiary of folks like yourselves who mentored folks who perhaps were frustrated with the world. I think we all can remember kind of what it was like to be a teenager, what hormones will do to you as far as like anger, frustration, and kind of the chaos of going through your teens. And I remember just how important it was to have that space for me to hone in on my consciousness. I've been working at CompassPoint for 5.5 years. In the time here, I've doubled down on really understanding how important nonprofits can be in fundamentally supporting the shifting of resources. And so what do I mean by shifting of resources? I mean shifting of resources to change people's material conditions. And material conditions is essentially your economic well-being and the conditions in which you are expected to live. So I do think that there is something intrinsic to the nonprofit sector that allows for us to really hone in on what material conditions need to be shifted and what is our role in doing that in tandem with other sectors, the public sector, the private sector, et cetera. At my core, and you'll notice this on the picture up here, this work for me is really about honoring the legacy of which I come. So my grandmother took me in when I was, I think, 2.5 years after my mother passed. And she embodied a politic that to this day inspires me to get out of bed. So I'll speak plainly. Some days I'm exhausted, just like y'all. Other days I'm frustrated with the world around me. Many times I feel hopeless. And then I go back and look at pictures of my grandmother, and I think of a woman who spent 82 years navigating many systems that did not advantage her, and did so with a strong belief of faith in humanity, in our shared humanity, a belief in the power of building community, and then I think more so important for this conversation, a strong commitment to the pursuit of doing good by others, right? And so in her words, she would define that as a pursuit of righteousness, but really she had a commitment, a moral and political imperative to do good and to do right by others. And that is what I think can be such a powerful thing for us to lean into. And what is our role in doing that in our nonprofit organizations? Last but certainly not least, my connection to the region. Susie alluded to the experience that I had over the last 2 to 2.5 years working with the Next Generation Leaders of Color program. That program was made possible due to the contributions of the California Wellness Foundation, the Weingart Foundation, and the California Endowment, as well as the Guillermo J. Valenzuela Foundation. So I want to thank them for their support and for introducing CompassPoint into the Inland Empire and Inland region. What I learned about your region throughout that time is that there's an abundance of brilliant folks, so many brilliant leaders who are committed to telling the unique story of working in a nonprofit within the Inland Empire. And I learned about the hustle within this region, by which I mean the determination of folks like yourselves to make things happen, no matter what resources are available to you. I also learned about how your region is truly a political bell cow in terms of understanding the future of California and California politics, in terms of cultural composition, the socioeconomic diversity you have, and the geographic diversity and how the sprawl plays into this conversation. So I want to thank the leaders of the NGLCIR program, who I know many of whom are on this call, Tiers 1 and Tiers 2, for all the lessons that y'all imparted on me, on the CompassPoint team, and for sharing that learning space with us. So what is the moment that we find ourselves in? I got some choice images here of which I'll walk us through. We don't find ourselves in simple times, y'all. And I don't think you have to look very far to understand exactly what I mean by that. But here are some of the ways in which I'll frame this moment. Globally, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC communities are in distinctly more vulnerable positions relative to exposure of COVID-19, financial crisis, long-term environmental detriment, criminalization, and mortality. Overall, for those who have lived in precarity, and by precarity, I mean conditions of which they are facing poverty, they're made more precarious in the immediate and long-term journeys that we're on, while the government financial support continues to support mostly wealthy folks and the most extractive corporations. So capitalism is growing ever more virulent, as COVID-19 spreads across the world and is working as designed, in my humble opinion. In the United States, Black and Indigenous folks particularly are dying at extremely high rates relative to other populations due to the global pandemic and due to how this pandemic is taking root in our country. In Michigan, there's an alarming rate of more than 40% of COVID-19 related deaths that were in African-American communities. In the few states, they're recording the impact on Native and Indigenous communities and Indigenous people, that the rate of death is double or triple the percentage of the entire population. These are astounding numbers, and they should shock you. They should make you feel some type of way. If you've been watching and paying attention, I'm not going to go into partisan politics, but what I will comment on is our electoral infrastructure is not set up to support the type of democratic engagement that we need in 2020. That's going to have a significant impact on all political levels, municipally, statewide, at the national level, in a critical election year. So the evidence of calculated efforts to suppress democratic participation across different regions in our state and in our nation continues to become ever worth investigating. As it pertains to our organizations, there's an array of nonprofit and social justice organizations that are focused on meeting vital needs day in and day out in our work. And the reality is that they continue to dwindle in terms of their capacity to deliver due to economic collapse, by sheltering in place, by an economy that is currently unable or ill-equipped to deal with funding this sector. And to make things even more complicated, foundation endowments are being significantly reduced due to market insecurity, which is leading to some notable level of trepidation around fiduciary concerns of the future. So when we think about the fiduciary concerns of the future and a foundation's inability to be able to give more, that's kind of directly at odds with the critical needs of this moment as it pertains to our sector. I know that the information I just shared in framing this moment paints somewhat, if not an extremely grim picture. But at this time, I think that there's a profound chance to get real within our organizations about the opportunity of this moment. I've seen a lot in the media and in social media, even in the professional space that I'm navigating as of 2020, that's been pushing us to respond in a way that gets us back to normal. But that framing falls short of what we need in this moment and the movement context of which we should be preparing ourselves for. We need to be fighting for a new normal. If we are truly about the pursuit of equity and justice, we shouldn't be calling for a return to normal. And when we loudly project a call to do so, I might ask, normal for who? Normal for the millions of people who were already food insecure prior to COVID-19? Normal for the 150,000 plus folks across our state who were houseless or facing some form of housing instability and housing insecurity prior to this pandemic? Normal for the families of thousands of Black and brown folks who've been victimized by excessive force at the hands of state-sanctioned violence and police departments? There's a question that we need to be asking ourselves in community and within our organizations. What is the new normal that we're striving for? I'm privileged enough, due to the work that I'm currently entrenched in, to be in close proximity of folks working with leaders like yourself every day to know we have the capacity, the brilliance, and the wherewithal to grapple with allowing ourselves to let go of the normal that used to be, that didn't truly serve our collective interest, and instead fighting for a future that will work for us all. So what are some of the things that I would encourage our organizations to grapple with as we prepare for a movement towards a new normal? There's about 5 things I'm going to lift up, and then some questions I'm going to ask you all to sit with as folks respectively and differently situated in your organization. The first is evolutionary purpose. If you've been in the nonprofit sector for long enough, you probably are familiar with the question of purpose. What is our purpose? Oftentimes, we can find that in our strategic plans. We can find that in the way in which we promulgate our mission. The organizations we work in, if we thought of them as living organisms, can start to take on a purpose of their own that responds to the environments we're in. This term evolutionary purpose comes from a book called Reinventing Organizations that I know Susie has lifted up as one of the potential prizes, I believe, for folks who are at the conference. It's a really, really wonderful book in understanding what's available to us, different levers to change our organizations. But if we think about, instead of trying to control and predict the direction of our organizations, what if we listen and understand naturally where organizations need to go? What does this mean in practice? Our organizations can contribute to the development of a new normal by assessing what our North Star truly needs to be in response to the communities we are serving, and developing our structures and culture to mirror that evolution in our purpose. I want to point out that the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, an organization based in the Pacific Northwest and also down south, they talk about the role of gatekeeping in nonprofit organizations. If we're gatekeepers to resources for community members, we cannot evade the fundamental question of how we are truly accountable to our communities in assessing the value of the services or experiences we provide. If our community doesn't have any power in redirecting the way we do our work, we are not creating equitable structures, nor are we establishing a new norm. Centering wholeness. We've got to start to build upon humanity in the way we think about human resources. I see and hear about day in and day out many folks who work in nonprofit organizations who complain about constant depletion, being overstretched, not having enough time to do their work, too many demands, and the ever-present threat and fear that lives in their minds as well as their bodies of job insecurity. What levers are available to us specifically in positional leadership to really think about the time that's needed for self-care, the assurances that transitions won't happen as surprises, and that there's spaciousness to do the work that builds on personal purpose. So why someone joined that organization, their personal drive, and that's paralleled by organizational need. The right risks. I came across this terminology first, kind of having water cooler kitchen talk with our former executive director, Jean Bell, who I want to tip my hat to for the role she's played at allowing CompassPoint to become the organization it is, as well as Asha Mehta, another former colleague. I've never seen change happen in an organizational environment without the complexity of potential consequences, making it that much heavier. So in that conversation, Asha and Jean were talking about some CompassPoint changes that needed to happen. And the concept of right risk was introduced to me pretty casually. I'm sure the concept doesn't uniquely belong to them and other folks have probably utilized it, but it opened up a world of possibility for me in framing towards leaders like yourselves, how we can be intentional and decisive in assessing which risks are worth taking. Is the risk that we're thinking about taking likely to help us further live into our missions? If so, maybe we should take it. Is the risk that the organization taking informed and inspired by a chance to further live into your espoused values? If so, likely we should take it. That sort of inquiry, both at the individual, interpersonal, and all organizational level, when done transparently, I think it allows us to really understand what's at stake, why we would take on a risk or why we wouldn't when we're faced with the chance to do so. Two more things that I really want to encourage around situating ourselves for the movement to come and the nonprofit association or response to it. A technical focus with a transformational approach. The technical details of what keeps our organizations working in impactful ways is extremely important and extremely vital to focus on. At CompassPoint, we've maintained that approach for the 45+ year history. And that said, there's now a question that increasingly is ever present and extremely important for us to sit with, which is how do we wed the technical with the transformational in a concerted way? So what do I mean by this? I'll give you two examples. Well-functioning financial systems and processes are beautiful. What's even better than that, though? Cultivating financial literacy of your staff, tending to the business acumen of folks who are not under your administrative or operational or business development umbrella, and so on. That way, when we do this kind of transformational approach to the technical details and the technical aspects of our work. We're giving folks less barriers to decisions that are made, more opportunity to understanding, and allowing for more permission for folks to give informed opinions about what's needing to be done from a place of organizational integrity and in response to organizational challenges. Another example is around supervision structures, of which many of our organizations likely have some model of supervision. Highly codified and well-documented supervision practices and policies are stellar, they are important, they are needed. And what's better than that? Folks understanding how the supervision structures that are being implemented are not coming from a place of control, are not rooted in coercion, but instead rooted in mutuality, interpersonal growth, and consent. So can we set our supervisors up for greater levels of success so that when they enter these relationships, they aren't seen as the inherent enemy or the obstacle towards someone's growth, advancement, or even just enjoying their job? Adjacent to that is, can folks who are supervised truly speak to how supervision within your organizational context promotes advancement, problem solving, as well as create space for them to unpack what they need to do so they can continue to work in purpose. Last but certainly not least is the question of embracing discomfort. There's an author named Tema Okun, who's one of the authors of ChangeWorks' Dismantling Racist Toolkits, talks about how discomfort is at the root of all learning and growth. So I think naturally when we hear the word discomfort, some of us get a little uncomfortable, right? However, discomfort isn't always something that's negative. So I'll think about a tangible day-to-day example. Well, not day-to-day with this new reality we're in. When I used to go and play basketball with my friends and with folks in community for a few hours, I'd come home and I'd be exhausted, I'd be fatigued, all types of muscle soreness, extreme amounts of discomfort of what I just endured and put myself through. But it was balanced out by joy, this kind of, the equivalent of runner's high for basketball players, the building of community and the memories, countless memories that I get from being able to be in a social network of hoopers, and also the just extreme ecstasy of giving people's buckets. Shout out Sean Livingston, greatest Golden State Warrior of all time. When I say that, I really want us to just be more deliberate in surfacing the why behind when folks are experiencing our collective discomfort, our individual discomfort, and for leaders to really set the stage for surfacing how that discomfort has led or will lead others to individual and collective growth. And I want to be clear that discomfort and fragility are not one and the same. Our fragility is ours to work through. I have experienced many different forms of fragility as a male-identified person in a changing world. As a younger person in an organizational context, there's been tons of fragility that I've had to work through peer networks, through mentorship, but that's not the same or equivalent or always akin to the discomfort that I've needed to go through in order to really be more responsive to the collective aims and collective goals of my organization at CompassPoint and to the work I'm stewarding. It's going to be a little bit of moment of time for Q&A. I noticed that there's some Q&A and some chat popping off, and want to just get us through these last few points that I want to ask folks to really sit with, especially knowing you'll be able to download the slides after this plenary talk. Questions for positional leaders. Why am I leading? That's a vital question that we should be asking ourselves at this particular time, if not now more than ever. What compels you to lead? What feedback have you been given about how your leadership positions the organization well in the pursuit of thriving? What are the feedback mechanisms available to you to support candor, authenticity, and some way in which you can visibly be accountable for recognizing requests made of you from those you lead? Power sharing. Decision-making clarity is super important for an organization to really sit with. What does that look like for us? And below that kind of surface level question of who makes what decisions and why sits, how does power exist in our organization? In order for our organizations to weather the storm that's coming, and the storms that we may find ourselves in the future, power cannot be hoarded for the sake of hoarding power. A healthy relationship to sharing power and to coaching others through an ambivalence to power or an aversion to it is going to be a much needed competency for our leaders in the 21st century. Vulnerability is another thing that I would encourage positional leaders to really sit with. Brene Brown talks about there being no courage without vulnerability, and vice versa. There's no vulnerability without being courageous. The practice of being vulnerable is a courageous act of leadership, and I fundamentally feel that way by virtue of seeing many leaders who practice vulnerability in a way that opened up and gave other folks permission to share what was really going on and to engage in some real talk. I think a lot of us were socialized to think that vulnerability can be perceived as weakness, even worse as incompetence, or just something that's not fitting for folks in leadership roles. I truly believe that that's an antiquated paradigm that has no real place in nonprofit organizations that are committed to social transformation. When we're positional leaders and we're honest about where we are, what we're experiencing, what we know, what we don't know, we give permission to members of our organizations to do exactly that as well. And I think that fosters much more authentic ways of engaging with one another and also gives us more insight to what the solutions are for the challenges we face. Specifically for my white folks on this call, there's two questions I might ask y'all to sit with in this particular time. What is allyship? What does your practice of allyship look like? Allyship can be defined as in-group folks or privileged folks supporting out-groups or marginalized folks. This is not only a call to white folks. I am a member of an in-group as somebody who navigates this world as a male-identified person. I've been privileged in many ways by virtue and bestowed upon me by no merit of my own to be able to go to a healthcare system and to not have doctors interrogate me about my needs. That's one example of male privilege that I've experienced. But for today, I'm highlighting race as one of the clearest ways to practice allyship, especially in response to the zeitgeist of today. So what can you do with the privilege that you have accessible to you to lift up the experiences of folks who don't have that? A commitment to anti-racism, what does that look like to disrupting racism? There's overt racism and there's subtle forms of it in this society. As Dr. Cornel West says, within the American context, racism is the ugly underbelly of America. America in all its promise and greatness and the true democratic spirit that many of us want to lead into also has an ugly underbelly, and we're increasingly seeing what that looks like in real time. So awareness is our first step. Action is the next. What actions are you taking? There's assertive actions you can take, and there are passive actions. And I leave y'all as white folks to really sit with that in some regular level of commitment and frequency, returning to what does that look like for you? And how is that helping to alleviate some of the conditions that folks are facing in your networks, in your organizations, and in community? Last but certainly not least, for BIPOC folks, which is an abbreviation for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, how are you affirming your own leadership? And how is it being affirmed within your organizational context and within community? So much of my own experience has been finding those sanctuary spaces where my leadership can be affirmed. I learned very early on how to code switch. I learned very early on how to navigate spaces where I was the only Black person. And that, to some extent, served me well. And what it didn't do or didn't help to address was some of the internalized harm that I was perpetuating amongst myself, telling myself that certain ways in which I was raised as a Black man, culturally, messages that I had known to be points of personal pride were not acceptable in the workplace, or were something that just didn't fit the mold of where I was trying to get. So I needed to get into those spaces where my leadership can be affirmed, where my lived experience could be shared and praised and celebrated. How do you do that within your own working environment? And what are the spaces you need to create or that you need created so that that can be actively attended to? Last but certainly not least, shaping culture within our organization. So much of organizational work is around structure and culture. Structures and cultures influence one another, but when we think about being in organizations that are responsive to us in our wholeness, where we come from, where we're trying to go, and where we're currently at, how do we go in to our jobs to the professional relationships we enter in a way that lifts up the kind of culture we need to feel like we truly belong. So that's it for the offerings that I have for you all today. And I saw several times some Q&A. So I'm going to try and cue that up, knowing that I think we have about a few minutes. I could be incorrect. I think my next session starts at 10. The next session starts at 10 to kind of get into these questions. So if someone on the tech side can help point me to the Q&A, I don't see any open or unanswered questions right now. Now, for those who are participants, this is a good time to lift up any questions in the Q&A box in Zoom.
You can also put them in the chat if you aren't familiar with using the Q&A. There it is.
Q&A, chat, let's see. Here we go. What is the hardest part of your work? I would say thank you for that question. First and foremost, the hardest part of my work, I think, is the emotional labor. At this particular time, knowing the constant crisis that folks are experiencing, when you open yourself up to that, really being in a place of doing that inner work to be a receptacle of all the different emotional and tumultuous times that folks, the emotional roller coaster and the tumultuous times that folks are sifting through. That's the hardest part of the work, and that's what sits with me. So when I come home and I talk to my partner or I talk to family members, oftentimes I'm really trying to make sure that I'm coming into my workspaces healthy enough to be the receptacle of folks who are also exploring all the challenges of today. So I would definitely say it's the emotional labor that really sits with me, I think, the most, both in tending to my colleagues and then tending to people that I'm privileged enough to work with in community and externally. Thank you for that question. Curious if other folks have questions. Ooh, look at this. What's your thoughts about our presidential candidates? I will say that I hope that people go out and vote. That is my strong opinions. Vote for whomever speaks to your lived politic and community. That's where I'm going to rest on that question. I feel like as far as partisan politics go, I make it a personal practice to try and be as candid as possible about I vote with my conscience, and that's where I go. So, you know, on presidential candidates, I'm going to vote with my conscience. And for me, that will really mean that when I get into my mail-in ballot, I'm doing so thinking about where I come from. Thank you for that question too. I see that. What is one best piece of advice for leaders? I'm gonna turn y'all back to that slide I just had, which is the question, constant interrogation. Interrogation doesn't always have a best association. Constant inquiry with oneself around why am I leading? Why am I leading right now? What is this doing for the communities that I'm serving, for the organizations that I'm leading, and how is it nourishing me? So I would definitely say that's the best advice I can give you around being a leader. And again, thinking about leadership as an act and not a position. When you are wanting to step into new forms of positional power, asking that fundamental question of why me? What is the process for my nonprofit to get connected with CompassPoint? At the end of this slide, you'll have my contact information. So I'll show that in just a moment. Let's see if I can do it right there. That's one way you can get in contact. If not, you can also just go to www.compasspoint.org. And we're more than happy to be in conversation with organizations across the state and across the country. Ooh, here we go. I got a lot of questions over here. Thank y'all. Have you ever had to handle a situation when one colleague was not accepting of another's diversity? Absolutely. Yeah. And those have been some of the more difficult conversations to steward. When you say diversity, I'm curious behind, what types of diversity you mean. There's divergence and diversity of thought. There's diversity of age. There's all types of different levels. Oftentimes when we hear diversity, we go immediately to race, but there's multiple ways in which I think about diversity. So there's been many a times where there's been situations where folks have said, you know, I just don't understand where you're coming from, when people were sharing where they were coming from on the basis of who they are. And what one of my colleagues, Steve Liu, used to do at CompassPoint, which is actually the workshop that informed me or influenced me to go to CompassPoint, was a workshop on communicating across cultural differences. So it was actually taking a moment to really sit with, how do I go from just a place of tolerating who someone else is, which is one form of engaging with diversity, to accepting who they are. The difference between tolerance and acceptance, and then communication practices that support that. So thank you for that question on how, having had to handle situations like that. How hard has it been during our current pandemic to maintain and affirm your leadership? Incredibly hard. I would say incredibly hard. And if it wasn't for a community of a network of support, having mentors and mentees who can affirm my leadership, you know, I probably would be in a different place as far as confidence and stepping into leadership, and also security and wanting to continue to lead. So I really encourage folks to find spaces of affinity, whether that's peer-to-peer, mentors, elders in your community, who can help you maintain and affirm your leadership. I think the only other question I'm seeing is, as BIPOC, how can you advocate the importance of diversity and cultural competence in a workplace that doesn't have those values in place? That's a really good question. Advocating the importance of diversity and cultural competence in a workspace is not just like, it's not a supplemental thing for organizations in 2020. It is necessary, and it should be a mandate. The world is a diverse place. We live in a multicultural country. If our organizations as microcosms don't mirror the macro needs, we're not setting ourselves up for success. So to advocate for the importance of it is to say, just look beyond the walls of this organization. Right now, more than ever, if we don't come to terms with just truly how diverse this country is and accept the beauty of that, and also developing more competencies so that we can communicate more effectively in less divisive ways in our organizations, we're not going to be set up for the world and the challenges of the 21st century. So I would definitely say it is not just something nice to do, it is imperative. And I also think it fosters better ideas and greater innovation. When you have diverse workspaces and culturally competent workspaces, you have more access to a wider worldview. And a wider worldview sets your organization up to serve a larger constituency, I should say. I think we're at time, and I'm getting great questions. So I'm gonna pass it to Susie to kind of give us instructions on making sure folks get to their other sessions.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Cad. Applause, applause, applause. It's such a great voice for us to all hear. And I think sharing your voice, we've had the privilege of being with you for over a year with the Next Gen Leaders of Color. So today, when, like I said, we were planning this, it was so important to have your voice today. And for me, thinking about lifting up the important issues that you brought up with such purpose and insight, but also on a personal note, and I leave that for everyone today in the conference, is there's something you hear that resonates with you. For me, it was your conversation with your grandmother, of course, do good right by others, right? I think that was a theme that I'm gonna take away, as well as the right risk. I don't remember ever hearing that. So I jotted it down, and we as leaders need to be intentional about what risks are worth taking. So it also lifts that premise for us and our work we're doing. So again, much thanks for starting this 2-day conference with your voice this morning. So thank you again. Thanks. Hey, applause, applause.
Thank y'all so much.
You're welcome. And Cad and Emily from CompassPoint will be here for the first session. So if you want to hear more about some of the work that they're doing, you can step into that session afterwards. So thank you. With that said, I know we're kind of almost to time, but I have the distinct honor first to introduce our sponsor today for the conference is El Sol. El Sol is also a CBA alumni from cohort number 1, but also an IECC member. They would like to just take a moment for me to introduce the team member, Joina Gascon from El Sol. She's a promotora, and talk a little bit about the work they're doing before we get to breaking out into the other rooms. So if I can just have Joina join us for a moment.
All right. Hello, everyone. I seem to be having some difficulties. Oh, here we go.
You.
All right, thank you so much for having me. Good morning. I'm just here to talk to you guys a little bit about the work that the promotoras or the community health workers of El Sol have been doing most recently. I know under these standards of the pandemic, life is a little bit difficult to run our organizations or even accomplish what we had set goals for. So I'm here to talk to you about the Listos California campaign. What is the Listos California campaign? It's a state initiative that set a couple goals just to, so one of the goals is to engage over 1 million diverse and socially vulnerable Californians in disaster preparedness. And this engagement was intended to be culturally and linguistically competent. So El Sol as an organization has committed to 210,000 of those 1 million Californians. So that is over 20% of the commitment that California has set. And we are all working in various regions of the San Bernardino County trying to make sure that this information is shared with everyone. And we also want to build resiliency in the hard to reach communities at high risk for wildfires, earthquake, and flood. Like Cad mentioned in his presentation, the current state of what we are in is a difficult state to be in. And we want to be able to make sure that all of our Californians can make it through this difficult state. And then we also want Californians to see themselves as first responders. They know what to do to take care of their family and to take care of themselves. So with that being said, there are 5 steps that we do recommend that everyone follow, and there will be a video shortly after to reinforce those steps. So the number 1 step is we want you to sign up to get alerts. So that's through calalerts.org, My Great Shakeout. There's plenty of resources out there to receive alerts so you know when a disaster is happening and you know what to do. 2, make a plan to protect your people. I have kids, I have grandma at home. Where do I want them to be in the event of an emergency? Or what do they do if an earthquake strikes and I'm not around to help them? 3, we want to get to safety with the things you need. Have a go bag ready and packed to go when you leave, or in the event that you need to leave your home. Step 4, stay safe at home when you can't leave. I know a lot of us are under this circumstances right now with the pandemic. We want to be able to be sure that when the grocery stores run empty again, do I have what's necessary at home to feed my family and to take care of us? And lastly, we want you to help friends and family. We work together better as a unit. We worked we can do greater things together. So how do these steps help? It can help you avoid unnecessary fear and stress. Your family will know what to do and who to call. You will have the things you need to be comfortable. And lastly, you will be able to help others. So that's all the information that I have from you from the Listos California campaign. If you and your organization are interested in learning more, if you want to prepare your staff, we are more than happy to help. We can be reached on any of our social media platforms at El Sol Nec, or my contact information is up on the HUVA, so you're more than welcome to reach out to us. And thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And El Sol being the sponsor this year for the conference. Again, it's nonprofits helping other nonprofits. So mil gracias. Un placer.